A few years ago, actually quite a few years ago now, a family that I was close to, they had one child. The girl was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and the wife became pregnant for the second time. And they were very happy to increase their family. And one day, though, the couple came to talk to me, and it was sort of the situation which often happens, where the woman turns to her husband and says, "Tell her," like this. And so he sort of looked a little chagrined like this, and then he said to me something that's been so touching to me ever since. He said, "Of course, we're happy that this new baby is coming." He said, "But I love my daughter so much, I can't imagine that I could love anyone else as much as I love her." And it was so sweet to me in the moment. And he was concerned, how can he be a father to another child, because he had such a preference for his firstborn. And I've borne no children myself in this lifetime, but incarnational memory is the same as present. And all I could say to him was, "You'll see." And after the baby was born, he came over and he said, "I have seen." Now, his dilemma has always stayed with me on such a deep level for so many obvious reasons. But one of them is the way the human ego divides up the world, and because by its very nature, the ego is limited. The ego is the infinite soul identified with one particular body. It's a very subtle definition Yogananda gave us. It's not just saying, well, egotism is a bad thing, and if you're egotistical, that's not good. It's just that we are, in fact, infinite in our nature. But we get confused because we're born into this one body, we live in it, everything we can remember for the most part has to do with it, although anomalies break through all the time. But if we're a man, we're not a woman. If we're young, we're not old. If we're American, we're not French. And so all of these different fragmentary things cultivate in us a sense of lack. And of course, in a materialistic society like the one that we live in which consumerism is probably the only religion we have, except for football, maybe. Speaking of what people do on Sunday mornings. One of my friends, their daughter was on a soccer team, and week after week, as the mother said to me, we just kept winning. Weekend after weekend after weekend, every day we had to go. She was explaining why they weren't in church for weeks at a time, because the team kept winning, and then they had to go to the next. But the only religion we have really is materialism. Religion in the sense of where we think our happiness comes from. I heard a late night talk show once, the question was asked, why are we so insecure? And she answered, because of advertising, which is just perfectly obvious when you think of it. We're absolutely assaulted in a very calculated and deliberate way with continual messages that whatever we have, it isn't enough. And even if we have a lot of it, we bought the wrong thing. And even if it was good last week, it's clearly not any good anymore. And so there's always this feeling of inadequacy within us that is cultivated from the outside in our particular culture, but also it really is inherent in the system. We have separated ourselves by our consciousness, and that's the great unanswerable why, which I'm not going to touch right now. We'll just take it as the given. Regardless of why, this is where we find ourselves. We find ourselves caught with this belief that our access to happiness, to love, to prosperity is limited. And I know people now talk about prosperity. You can be anything you want. You can have anything you want. It's all just a matter of your ideas. Well, to a certain extent. Because as long as we are fundamentally limited by the ego, we cannot simultaneously be infinite. And so the fundamental practice of all spiritual practices is to identify with a greater reality. And every spiritual practice that there is, from kindness to feeding the poor to Kriya Yoga meditation, has really only one purpose. It's not an end in itself. And this is where religions argue with each other about which means to use. Do we bow to the east? Do we speak in Hebrew? Do we use Sanskrit prayers? Do we consider God to be blue and playing a flute? Do we have no idols or images at all? But none of those things in and of themselves really define anything. They're all, if they're true teachings, and some are corrupt and some are true, are meant for one thing, for us to identify with a greater reality than just what the little ego has told us is ourselves. Why should we be kind to others? Why should we be generous to others? Because in fact, the separateness that we experience is an illusion. And so many difficulties come to this because of this illusion. Isn't that so? We just do so many things that afterwards, when we think about them, why did I respond that way? Why did I not hold my center in that moment? Why did I think by passing on the misery, I myself would have less? I've shared with you a story of an experience I had once when David and I were traveling in this motorhome. We did this before we came to live here, which is now, actually, on January 4th is our 25th anniversary, I think, of living in this area and doing this particular job in this particular place. Prior to that, we did this job in many places. And we had a motorhome that belonged to Ananda, and we drove around in it. Forgive me, some of you have heard this story, but it's exactly what I want to talk about today. We were driving somewhere through mountains. I don't remember where. We took a long 3-month trip in this motorhome, lecturing around the southwest and the northwest. And David was driving, and it was a big motorhome, and I was in the back fixing a peanut butter sandwich, a 1-pound jar of peanut butter, which is a fairly significant item, I found out, because it was sitting on the kitchen counter, and David made a sharp movement. The road was curving, and later he told me that he had become a little inattentive, and so he did make a sharp movement. But at the time, I didn't realize that he was actually at fault, which might have changed the whole story. But anyway, all that happened to me was I'm standing there fixing a peanut butter sandwich, and the peanut butter jar takes a dive off the counter, just slides right off and lands right on my foot. And this is when I realized what a substantial entity a peanut butter jar is. And it hit my foot, and you know how it is. You have a sharp, unexpected pain. And there's a tendency to cry out in one way or another. So the thing hit my foot, I felt the pain in my foot, and I immediately had this impulse to yell at David. It's like, in the moment I thought he was innocent. But fortunately, just before, which he wasn't, but just before, poor man, when I married David, which was almost 30 years ago at the end of this month, he's not a talkative person as I am, as you all have noticed over these 25 years. Just before we got married, I said, you know what's about to happen. Your very private life is about to become public. I said, it was a serious question. What do you think? Because everything that happens to me, I tell everyone. That's my nature. And now that you've happened to me, you're likely to be part of my story. And I saw, that sort of like the double breath. There was the double breath, there was the silence, this long silence. And then he said, just tell the truth. So I'm telling the truth. So you signed up for it. Anyway, there we are. And I had this impulse to yell at him. But something in me caught it. And just the craziness of the fact that if I imposed pain on him with my words, that my foot wouldn't hurt. Because it was so ridiculous that there was no relationship between the two realities, I've contemplated it all these many years since. But how many times we don't catch it? How many times something is happening in our world that's very disconcerting to us? Responsibilities that we can't meet, people's behavior, and they insist on behaving according to their own lights instead of the way you think they ought to behave. And things begin to go out of control, and you can't hold them. So you try to grab control where you can grab control. And what you do is you try to pass on the misery. I'm tense, you must suffer. I don't like this is what's happening, you have to change. As if that's going to help. As if by increasing the misery, there will be less misery. But how often we do that? Because the ego identifies with a limited reality, and it thinks if I build a stronger fort around this little area that I have, then I will be safe. Never understanding that the only security we will ever have is when we become fearless about it all. Absolutely fearless about everything. For a very simple reason, because nothing is separate from ourselves. And all the suffering that we have, by definition, is only even possible when we have limited the potentials, when we have defined this is good, this is bad, this helps me, this doesn't help me. And spiritual teaching talks God's will, accept God's will. And you know, before you really capture that on some internal level, it sounds crazy, really, doesn't it? Oh, the Holocaust against the Jews, it was God's will. The genocide in Rwanda, it was God's will. Accept God's will. Well, that's no God I want to accept. I mean, if that's what God is like, I don't want to have anything to do with him. Many people come into this temple for the first time. Often they'll come into our meditation class because they're interested in meditation, but they're really not interested in God. And they sort of find themselves here, and you know, they see the pictures on the altar, and if the meditation teacher's just comfortable spreading out all these things, there's all this conflict of mind. And almost everyone who has come to me as an atheist is an atheist for a very good reason, because no concept of God that's ever been given to them was really worth the attention of an intelligent person. You know, just check your brain at the door. Just accept all this suffering and injustice purposelessly. Why? Why would we? You know, the human spirit demands more. The intelligent, educated mind demands more. The person of this century demands more. We have to have something that fits with our bigger reality. And the wonderful thing about self-realization as a path is it isn't about a promise. It isn't about, oh, after you die, you'll see. I remember as a very small child sitting on my grandfather's knee. I didn't see my grandparents very often. These grandparents lived in Key West, Florida, at the time before it became what it is now, which is a tourist mecca. Then it was just a tiny little island at the end of Florida. And he was a Jewish man, helped found the synagogue there, and I remember it was a Friday and he was going off to his synagogue, and I remember saying to him, do you really believe in God like that? I don't remember really contemplating these questions much, but I asked him. He said, well, I think of it this way. If after I die I'm wrong and I'm wrong, I won't know it. And if I'm right, I'll be very glad, you know, which was kind of, I've always remembered it, but it didn't satisfy me. In a certain sense, it was kind of a silly answer that we'll just wait and see. He was just, I couldn't have been more than 5 or 4, so he wasn't really trying to talk to me seriously. But that wasn't enough for me. A gamble. One of my Catholic friends, when he was about 6, the nuns told him that if he followed all the rules of Catholicism, he would have a bigger house in heaven. He was always very grateful to have been given such a ridiculous answer because it freed him right from the start, you know, of having to pay any attention to what was asked of him because it just wasn't worth it to him. You know, my question was very different. My question was, I don't want to suffer, I want to be happy. And it's not enough that, oh, I'll suffer through this whole incarnation and then I'll have an eternity of singing in choirs of angels. I couldn't sing very well anyway. That was a really awful prospect to me. But suffering today is very real. And the teaching of self-realization, especially as Swami Kriyananda offers it to us, is so grounded in practicality. I read recently, I'm just in some notes that I've taken over the years about Swamiji's life. He made a comment once that Master told him that he would not be given visions in this lifetime. And Swamiji spoke of some past life experiences as to why that wouldn't happen for him, that he wouldn't be able to come back and tell us about legions of angels and things like that. He said, but the other reason was that it was necessary, has been necessary, that what he teaches be absolutely grounded in practical life. Because that's what America needs right now, and that's what spirituality needs right now, practical life. And that practical life is, I can look at my reality now, and the more limited I am, the less happiness I have. And the more expansive I am, the more I include other people's realities in my own reality, the more, not even as a question of them being happy, but the bigger I'm able to think about my life. If I think about my life as I get up every morning, I do these certain things, and anything that breaks my routine causes me a difficulty here. I didn't get my avocado this morning, my spine feels weak. That was the one that Master would talk about when he would talk about the extremeness of people's attitudes toward their little habits. There was this man, the Yogananda tells the story, this man came up to him at a public lecture and declared, "I have cheated death 3 times with carrot juice," the man said to Master. Meaning, I've kept myself so healthy that I haven't died. And Master returned to him, he said, when death wants you, you can bathe in the stuff and it won't help you. There's the joke told about the couple that goes to heaven, and when they get to heaven, they discover it's a beautiful country club with a perfect golf course, and they can play golf every day. And the man turns to the woman and he says, if it wasn't for you and those damn bran muffins, we would have been here a long time ago. But in any case, we find that the more narrowly we define our reality, there's only one person that suffers, and that's us. Isn't it so? The more things happen and we don't have the flexibility to accept them, the more other people's behavior diverges from what we expected. A friend of ours, a man who used to live in this area and helped us from time to time, was a ballet master. He was the artistic director. He's gone to some other place now to be the artistic director of a ballet company. He was himself a beautiful ballet dancer. I'm not talking about the Reyeses. This is a different family, different man. Daniel, I think his name was. Daniel was born in a small town in Texas to a cattle ranching family. He was the 12th child. All his brothers and sisters stayed and became cattle ranchers, and his passion was ballet. I mean, picture it, right? And his poor parents, fortunately by 12, I think they were a little worn out, and it wasn't quite as bad as if he'd been their firstborn, but they didn't know what to do with him, ever. And finally he just went away. That was the only thing he could possibly do. But how difficult it is. We give birth to these children and we have such expectations. We know just what it's going to be like. It's going to be exactly like the family we had or nothing like the family we grew up in, just depending on where you are in this. And your children will be your friends and they'll do this and that. And whoa, look at that. They're their own soul with their own destiny. We either expand into realities other than our own, or we suffer. And the whole spiritual path is just expanding. Where is the limit? In our Education for Life system, Swami Kriyananda defined true education, exquisite definition, true maturity. The purpose of education is to help children become mature. And to be mature is to be able to relate to realities other than your own. And we watch that the happier we are, the more we can relate to realities other than our own, the happier we become. The more of the world we can embrace, the less threatening the world is. The more we're disinclined to just try to pass on misery in the imaginary thought that that will reduce the quantity of misery we have. And every time we take a step in that direction, we feel so much happier, don't we? And the question is a very simple one. How far can we go? Where is the limit of that expansion? And ever again and again through your awakened sons, the answer comes. We are infinite. Yogananda was asked, is there any end to evolution? He said, no, evolution goes on until we achieve endlessness. So it's easy to justify ourselves. It's easy to say, well, if you'd been treated that way, you would have responded too in that manner. It's easy to say, well, I was so aggravated, and it's fine.
these things happen. The past lives of all men, Sri Yukteswar said, are dark with many shames. It's quite something, isn't it? I was listening to Swami Kriyananda's Christmas satsang in India, and he was talking a little bit about past lives and what's been said to him, very high states of consciousness that he achieved. Oh, he said, and then I argued with my guru, and I fell. He just says it very casually. Oh, I argued with my guru, and then I fell. And Brighu, this great sage of ages ago, said, and I would have to wander in delusion until I met Yogananda, and then I would be freed. He just says it just like that. And we take our little mistakes and we hoard them like this, and we think they're so precious to us, and we think nobody's ever had one, and absolutely we don't want anyone to know, and when people speak of it, we stand like this, Whoa, thank God we can't remember our past lives. We would never get out of bed in the morning. Just pull those covers up, But this is just the way it is. We feel justified, but the great challenge of the yogi is to realize you're never justified. It may have been understandable. You see, that's quite different. It's understandable given the circumstances that you would have responded that way. But if happiness is your goal, we must expand our reality until it becomes impossible. Impossible to pass on the misery because you're not passing it on to anyone. If you're just hitting yourself on the head, it doesn't take long to realize it's not a good idea. Partly because you send the energy out, and it just is this marvelous boomerang. Any action that you take that you have identified with is still tied with you, and the worst thing is, darn it, it never goes away. You might not see it for a while. You might just be walking down the street 15 lifetimes in the future, whack, like a wet fish, right? It hits you in the back of the head. Like this. It may be understandable, but it's never justified if bliss is your goal. The spiritual path, there's so many complexities, fascinating complexities, but in the end it becomes very simple. We must learn to relate to realities greater than the one we already know. Swamiji tells us that the difference between being sound asleep and waking up into ordinary consciousness doesn't begin to describe the difference between ordinary consciousness and the superconsciousness that is our own nature. Swamiji says, Master's consciousness is without limit. Master says to Swamiji, if you knew my consciousness. Well, the good news is we will. And whether we realize it sooner or whether we realize it later is really just a question of how sincerely we persevere. And we are not merely a building, we are a community. We are a community of souls gathered together, the Ananda community for self-realization. That's who we are. We help each other. Sometimes we help each other by passing on the misery to someone who gives it back to us. And then we get to say, oh. And sometimes we help each other by holding each other's hands, resisting the impulse to pass on the misery and instead pass on the sympathy or the compassion or the love or the laughter. It is of inestimable value to have one another, to have a place we can come to have souls who share our aspiration, to have people we can learn from who will forgive us, who will say, well, you might not have been justified, but it's understandable. And then, together, turning our back on the past, looking to the future, and walking into that greater reality which is our own nature. God bless you.